Good morning, everybody. I'm your host, Phil Hendricks. I'm the past president, South African Road Federation, and I'm currently the non-executive director on the board of Zatari. It's a great pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar, which is part of the South African National Road Agency's Road Transport Foresight study, where you'll be hearing eminent thinkers' views on the future of South Africa and the road transport sector. Now, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars in which you'll be able to hear the views of eminent thinkers. They'll be giving their views on the future of South Africa and, of course, the road transport sector. The 3 webinars comprise pre-recorded interviews with eminent thinkers selected and approved by SANRAL to consult on possible international socio-economic and political futures for South Africa, the region, and the international transport sector. These pre-recorded interviews were conducted from December 2021 to February 2022. Now, please note, typical things that influence drivers of change do change constantly. And these were the opinions of the presenters at the time of interview. So the current war between Russia and Ukraine had not started at the time of interview. And so the impact of a global event such as that has not been accounted for. The inputs from the eminent thinker interviews and these webinars will form a vital part of a proposed stakeholder workshop, where further stakeholder inputs will be sought, identifying the key solutions and technologies that will take SANRAL and the South African transport sector into the future. Now, much of today's webinar will focus on the strategic mega drivers and trends for the future of South Africa. If you look at the agenda, the webinar will start with some background remarks and information, firstly on SANRAL and Horizon 2030, which is its current strategy. It will also include some aspects of the research and development program. It will be presented by Priya Pillai from SANRAL's communication department. We will then move on and have some further information on the actual Foresight project, and that'll be presented by the project manager, Dr. Chris Rust. In the eminent speakers section today, we'll have 2 presentations on the strategic mega drivers and trends for the future of South Africa. I will then conduct a short closure and include a wrap up and some thoughts on the way ahead. Now, please note that in a large open forum of this nature, and considering the time constraints, it won't be possible to have any live discussions. So what we're asking you to do is to post comments and questions on the chat box. Note that your comments and questions can also be forwarded to chris@perc.co.za. Let me repeat that, chris@perc.co.za. So whilst your comments and questions won't be answered at this session, they'll be reviewed and included in the blog, where this recorded webinar will be available after the session. So let's now move on to the first introductory presentation by Priya Pillai.
Welcome to all participants in the SANRAL Eminent Thinker webinar. I am Priya Pillai from SANRAL's communication department. Firstly, let me provide some background to the webinar. In accordance with the SANRAL strategy, Horizon 2030, we have initiated a research and development program to position the roads industry for the future. This R&D program aims to develop key solutions and technologies across a number of focus areas, namely future transportation and technical innovation, transportation planning, public administration management and economics, pavements, asset management, traffic, road safety, geotechnical structures, drainage and hydraulics, and the environment. To this end, SANRAL has, through a formal procurement process, structured 7 research panels with more than 120 researchers participating. To position the R&D program to develop solutions for the future, we have embarked on a Foresight study. This study aims to determine the drivers of change and the trends 10 to 15 years from now that will influence the transport sector. This will be used to develop future scenarios for the transport sector, as well as a desired future that we can strive for. A second step will then be to determine the required new technologies and knowledge that will position the transport sector for the future. This webinar aims to obtain inputs and views from eminent thinkers locally and internationally about the future of South Africa and transport particularly. This input, combined with desktop research, stakeholder workshops, and futures data analysis, will be used to inform the future direction of the SANRAL R&D program. I am sure you are all, with me, looking forward to views of our eminent thinkers on the future. Enjoy the webinar.
Thank you to Priya for giving us that introduction to SANRAL's Horizon 2030 strategy and its research and development program, the aim of which, of course, is to position the agency for the future. This webinar then is part of the Foresight study project within that research and development program, seeking to identify trends, future scenarios, which will hopefully assist in determining a desired future. The intention then of the webinar, remember it's the first of three, is to hear the views about the future from eminent thinkers and experts in the industry. Let's now watch the second introductory presentation, which will be given by Dr. Chris Rust, which will give us some more background into the SANRAL Foresight project.
Welcome everyone. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the SANRAL Foresight project. The rationale for this project is that within a fast-changing world, accelerated by events such as COVID-19, SANRAL has decided to conduct a foresight study for the South African transport sector that will envision how the transport sector will change. This study aims to develop several possible future scenarios, 10 to 15 years from now, that could be analyzed and stress tested to enlighten the possible development paths for the transport sector. This will then be used to provide input into future planning of the SANRAL R&D program. The objectives of the program are firstly to develop a description and analysis of the current state and reality of the transport sector in South Africa. Secondly, then to develop a description and analysis of potential future scenarios for the transport sector. And then to formulate the technologies, knowledge, capabilities, and capacity required to move the transport sector from the current reality to the desired future state. And then lastly, to provide input into the formulation of the future SANRAL R&D portfolio. So the approach of the project is depicted in this diagram. First of all, here on the left, we start in the yellow block, defining the drivers and the trends that will depict the current reality of the transport sector. We then jump into the future and we determine potential future scenarios for the transport sector. And based on those, we define the desired state for the transport sector in South Africa. Based on this, we then determine the key solutions that we need to develop to take us to that desired state. And then we actually determine the technology gaps and knowledge gaps that will bridge the gap between the current reality and these key solutions that will take us to the future and hence the desired state for the transport sector. So we are working from the future backwards. The activities in the project are therefore as follows. First of all, a desktop study to identify drivers, trends, technology horizons, and so on. Secondly, to obtain eminent thinker inputs, of which this current webinar is one of the activities. Then followed by stakeholder workshops and a questionnaire to add information and prioritize drivers, trends, and technologies. To then develop potential scenarios and a desired future state for the transport sector. This is then followed by futures analysis and the definition of a network of activities to move us from the current reality to the desired future state. And finally, then to provide input, as I said, into the SANRAL R&D program to position it for the future of the transport sector and balance it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for clarifying the rationale behind the project, which will lead to the unpacking of several future scenarios, looking at the desired future state of the transport industry and to do with the associated future planning. As you indicated, this Eminent Thinker webinar is a key input into the project. We're now going to turn to the Eminent Thinkers videos, and we will watch two presentations that will focus on the strategic mega drivers and trends for the future of South Africa. These two presentations are pre-recorded interviews that were held firstly with Dr. Adrian Seville from the Gibbs Business School, and secondly, Dr. Andre Roux from the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Please don't forget, pose your questions, comments on the chat box. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to welcome today our eminent future thinker, Professor Adrian Seville. Professor Seville is currently the Director of the Centre for African Management and Markets at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, Gibbs. He's also an investment specialist at Genera Capital, a private and independent global multifamily investment office. He has been a successful entrepreneur and investment manager in the financial services sector for over 25 years, and was the founder and former CEO of Cannon Asset Managers. Professor Seville's passion for financial markets and the development of people is demonstrated by his professorship in economics and finance at Gibbs, and he's held this portfolio since November 2003. Through his media activity, his research and engagement in public policy, he has been an active and positive voice for development in South Africa. Adrian, thank you for joining me today. Really looking forward to the discussion.
Great to be with you, Phil.
Great. My first question for Adrian relates to future investment events or trends. And I'd like to know, from your perspective, which are the most important global and regional financial and investment events or trends that could impact South Africa in the next 10 to 15 years?
Phil, I think that those elements or factors remain very much the same as they have been over the last 100 years. South Africa, for all of its recent or modern economic history, and by that I mean since the discovery of diamonds and gold, South Africa has been what economists would call a small open economy. By small, it means that you are more likely to be impacted than to be the impactor. And by open, it means that you are heavily influenced by external events and factors. It has been that way for the better part of 130 years, that global forces and events, including world economic growth, which influences commodity prices, the demand for precious metals and minerals, i.e. Diamond, coal, gold, platinum, iron ore, all are important exports from South Africa. It doesn't determine their prices. The economy is their prices. So if you look over a long sweep, the 100 years or more that I've already referenced, the single biggest influence on South Africa's economic growth is not policy, it's not particular projects, it's not levels of investment in education or healthcare. In fact, the single biggest influence on South Africa's through the cycle economic growth is commodity prices. It remained to just the last 12, 18 months, and you think of the events under the COVID pandemic, when commodity prices collapsed in early 2020 and the South African economy was taken into deep, there was real concern about the damage that was. A lot of that has been reversed, and in particular, the concerns around absent tax revenue. Much of that has been reversed by the commodity price bounce that happened over the next part of 2020 and stayed elevated into 2021. It's a really long answer, but I think it's a very, very important aspect of understanding the direction of travel of the South African economy. As much as we would like to imagine that we are shaping our destiny, my argument is that our destiny, until we put our hands on that wheel and firmly take charge of those policy levers, our destiny is overwhelmingly influenced and shaped by global forces and factors, and in particular the commodity price environment.
Thank you, Adrian. So you've seen the fact that we're a small open economy, influence of commodities, the biggest issue. So, if we're going to make any policy decisions, we have to really be decisive. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think that there's many facets to that, Phil. And if we step in behind the banner or the veil of commodity prices, what is going on behind there? I think that's a first question that would equip us in understanding the prospects for South Africa. Are commodity prices likely to fall away? Are they going to stay vulnerable as they have been historically? Could we go into a commodity price super cycle, as they nicknamed it in the noughties decade? So thinking about what shapes and fashions commodity prices, and you can think of alternative energy as an important influence on platinum, for instance, and an evaporator of coal prices. So we're quickly into this wrestle then of, well, what does the future of energy look like? Is it renewable? Is it sustainable? Is it fossil-based? That's one element. Another element is we could think of very large sources of demand for precious metals and minerals. And I think in particular of the Chinese and Indian markets, where we're speaking of the better part of a 3 billion population. And it remains the case that the world's most valuable precious stones, or some of the world's most valuable precious stones, are found in South Africa. So that could have a very important influence. I think about energy markets, consumer markets, and if it's the case that the emerging market really does what the label suggests, i.e. emerge, then you're going to have commodity prices, and I'm not singling out any one commodity. Commodities is a very, very broad basket, but as a broad basket, commodity prices would find extraordinary support in that emerging market environment. And the South African economy, if policies are stable and encourage, facilitate investment in mining activity and the harvesting of not just the mining of non-renewables, but also the harvesting and management of renewables, those could have very, very important implications for the South African economy. Again, leaving that to the emerging market outcome to influence where we land up is actually taking the future out of our hands. So to bring that future into our hands, South Africa needs to do a whole bunch more away from those basic industries, those primary industries. And that's about development and transformation of the economy.
Thanks, Adrian. That's really clear. Thanks for that answer. Moving on, my second question I'd like to pose is, what in your view are South Africa's major growth stimulants and its biggest hindrances in the next 10 to 15 years?
Phil, I think that they are opposite sides of the same coin. And the single biggest challenge that South Africa faces is an absence of implementing critical structural reforms. South Africa has everything you need. We have abundant resource, we have stable policy, we have coherent policy. Those are ingredients that are so often missing in trying to build successful places. South Africa has those. Where we have fallen short is we've failed to implement those structural reforms. And so South Africa remains in a place that was fundamentally shaped by the apartheid architecture. And coming out of apartheid in the early 1990s, into the 90s with a democratic election, and then South Africa was brought in from the cold and welcomed, into the world economy. That was a critical moment that got us out of the cold and into the warmth. Over that 15-year period, South Africa enjoyed uninterrupted economic growth, 1994 to almost the time that we hosted the Football World Cup, uninterrupted, elevated economic growth. That is the longest, most elevated, sustained period of growth in South Africa's modern history, i.e. since the discovery of gold and diamonds. That came to a shuddering halt with global financial crisis and struggled to reignite because of, my argument now, because of structural impediments. And those structural impediments, we know them well, and they've been widely explored. Industrial concentration, underinvestment in infrastructure, shortage of skills, high distance to market, and investment in financial capital rather than physical capital. These are well documented. There is a Reserve Bank paper from the last part of the noughties decade, which really sets out what became known as the binding constraints, and identified them and articulated them really, really well. So what solves for the binding constraints is structural reform. And structural reform is about squaring up to each of these and fixing them, not talking about them. And what we've done for the last 10 years is we've done a lot of talking about them, identifying them, saying that they're going to be remedied, and they aren't remedied. As those constraints become more and more entrenched, you find increasingly discouraged investment appetite. You find unemployment rates go higher, not lower. You find that each economic growth recovery is less amplified and less animated than the one before. That's what we mean by structural. It is slowly sort of grinding us down. And that's what South Africa has to square up to. That is our single biggest risk, threat. It is also our single biggest opportunity. There's no guesswork that's needed here. We know exactly what the reforms are that are needed. They are well understood and they are well documented. And this is where economists sort of earn their living, in being grumpy. To overtell or retell. The job of the economist is to depress everyone. That's the place South Africa finds ourselves, the place we find ourselves in. And although we have policymakers who, for the recent past, have spoken about 5% economic growth per annum being possible, that is not South Africa's growth structure. South Africa's growth structure, as things stand, is 1.5%, 2%, barely better than population growth. And that's what you would call a stuck economy. We are in an economic straitjacket. That's our structural constraint. And we have to shift that if you want to find the upside.
Thank you, Adrian. Any positives you can think of when you look at the issues around structural reform?
Yeah, so Phil, staying with my economics track, then let me abandon my economic self and let me be optimistic. What's dangerous in thinking about what is possible is what I'll call a naive optimist. Nothing more dangerous than a naive optimist. Yes, we want to be optimistic. We want to see what's possible, but it must be probable. It must be realistic. And so what are the chances of things that are A, possible, and B, probable, that we can implement as part of the structural reform program or package? These have been identified and they're available. and so in no particular order, let me list what I would venture are some of the critical ones. The first speaks well, no, let me give a zeroth before I do the first. So the zeroth is that we stop talking about reform and we implement it. I mean, that is a precondition. If we keep talking about it, none of the rest is going to happen. So the precondition is we get out of the lip service and into the practice. The first is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And this requires a massive pan-African investment in infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I don't just mean the physical infrastructure of transport and transport corridors. I also mean the institutional infrastructure that we can process the movement of goods and services and increasingly people easily and quickly. This was one of the magic ingredients of post-World War II Europe, was the transport miracle as they pulled down borders and connected the region. If you think of the size of the investment that is needed in the Pan-African context, this is just an extraordinary prospect. Why should it matter to South Africa specifically? Why should I single South Africa out? Well, for the simple reason that South Africa is one of the most industrially advanced, industrially complex economies in the region, that we have the capacity to be the lead goose in this flying goose combination or configuration. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I would venture, is one key element. Now, that doesn't require intervention from South African policymakers. That requires intervention from African policymakers. So a much bigger ask, but that's on the table. It is installed and it is being implemented. And we are starting to see some advances in important investments in logistics, transport, infrastructure, and institutions. The second is a binding constraint in South Africa is increasingly expensive and unreliable energy infrastructure. If you are going to build renewable energy anywhere in the world, I would venture that the Northern Cape is your best place to go for two reasons. The one is the Northern Cape is the recipient of some of the highest photovoltaic irradiation in the world. And the second is we have an already established, robust renewable energy IPP framework. We've got the policy framework. We've shown that we can deliver investments in this arena. And now we've got this magnificent photovoltaic irradiation. It remains the case that, and this is not a made-up number, 99.5% of South Africa's energy is coal-fired. So there is a prospect here of venturing into big investments in renewable energy, and the cost of renewable has now come lower than the cost of non-renewable, and that cost continues to fall. That is a very real competitive prospect. The third is, how are you going to fund all of this? And South Africa has deep and sophisticated capital markets. They find their roots all the way back in the 1800s, late 1800s, to fund the expansion of the mining industry. And out of that, we built insurance businesses and bank businesses, the bond market, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Those are all now installed infrastructure, installed institutions. And it is the case that South Africa has very large investment pools of capital available for investment in infrastructure. Another dimension that I think could or should be added to all of this is none of this can happen with just one hand sort of fighting the fight. It needs both hands to be untied. And what I mean by that is this cocktail of public-private partnership. Now, public-private partnership became a toxic cocktail under state capture. That's what happens when you get it wrong. When you get it right, you get strong public-private partnership, building capacity and capability. We know how to do this, in part because we know what not to do because of the mistakes of the recent past. But also we don't have to invent the wheel here. There are many models of very successful private-public partnership that we can download and install from around the world. And maybe a final thought on the silver lining here is a bad dad joke, but the lowest hanging fruit is orange, and it takes the shape of orange overalls. Successful convictions, and the moment you say that, people think that you're talking about convictions of state officials, government officials. Not for one moment. That just as successful public-private partnership can't happen in a vacuum, state capture didn't happen in a vacuum. The public and private sectors were both engaged, and here the private sector will do well to recognize the mistakes of the past and ensure that they are not repeated, and to compete fairly, effectively, inclusively, transparently, and so to be a functional partner of the state.
If we can move on then, looking at some major socio-economic and investment drivers of change, what do you think those could be that could influence or alter our growth trajectory, both positive and negatively, in the next 10 to 15 years?
Phil, I think having started with a suggestion that the South African economy is a small, open economy, and we need to pay careful attention to global forces and factors, but perhaps I should stay with that and make the same acknowledgement in thinking about social and political factors. And I'm going to put political alongside social. I think it is very difficult to extract one from the other. Politics and the social setting are inextricably intertwined, and that's not unique or specific to South Africa. That is a universal phenomenon and feature. And sometimes they are coordinating and building elements, and sometimes they are divisive elements. And you'll think of country examples where politics and the social setting have worked together, and others where they have worked against each other. Well, maybe rather than leaving it up to guessing, I could point to some examples, and the Arab Spring is a case in point, or the policy decisions in China in the 1970s having a material impact on the number of babies that are born, and so its demographic structure. This is the interplay between politics and economics, and of course, the South African story, where people in this conversation need absolutely no introduction to the way in which politics can influence negatively, and more with the democratic era in South Africa, positively, social structure. So if we turn attention to the global environment, what's going on in world political order that we should be paying careful attention to. Maybe three things that demand very particular attention. The first is the tension between East and West. And that tension is, there's nothing new about it, but it does seem to be growing rather than easing. And in particular, a USA-China tension. And where all bets would come off is if China were to make a move on Taiwan. There is a lesser concern, but still very real and of global proportion, and that is if Russia were to make a move on the Ukraine. And of course, the United States, as a global superpower, also steps and missteps. So that, that's the first thing, I think to be giving careful attention to in considering social, political factors and influences. Pausing for breath there, the global demographic makeup has got a couple of features which are also worth mentioning, and if we can think of these as social drivers. And the first big social driver globally is the aging population in the advanced world, in developed markets. Mm-hmm. The developed market is now on average in its 40s. They are closer to retirement than to the start of their careers, and they stopped having babies 20 years ago. So they have, in many places, shrinking populations and aging populations. It's easy to be sort of glum about that and say, oh, well, that sounds rather depressing. But there are some really interesting things that are coming out of this, including new industries. Think of innovations in healthcare and new technologies. And a throwaway example would be things like exoskeleton, where exoskeleton has become a rapidly growing industry in Japan, where 70 and 80-year-old people can fit a robotic frame onto their bodies, and a woman can pick up her husband and carry him up a flight of stairs. That's the power of exoskeleton. It takes one step further and it quickly goes to robotics, where it's robots that start helping people and aging populations, aging affluent populations. If we then go to the emerging world, what's quite interesting, I think, in the emerging world is, broadly speaking, population growth has slowed. So as much as there's a lot of hand-wringing about population explosions and the world is going to run out of food and space, that isn't so much the concern as the world is rather going to run out of carbon sinks. So the world has the capacity to look after what is left of population growth. And I think we're very much in the late stage of population growth. That we're close to peak population. We will achieve peak population in this century, and that then asks about where do you get the inputs from for that peak population? It has to be sustainable. It has to be renewable, and now the economics starts to influence because it also has to be shared, and the world has become increasingly unequal. So now the economics starts to touch social aspects, that a world that feasts on unsustainable industries and non-renewable resources and produces carbon emissions that translate into global warming, all of that lands up in disaster. There is no version of that story that ends well. The only question is, or the only questions are, how does it end and when does it end? And the how is, it doesn't end well, it ends sadly. The when is harder to work out. That's on the input side. On the output side is, okay, all well and good if it is sustainable, but on the output side, what do you do with the things that happen as a result of this? Let's imagine a collectively affluent planet with 9 billion people all enjoying middle income status. That would translate, as things stand, into a lot of carbon emission. So where are the carbon sinks that are going to look after this? And that then gives birth to a whole bunch of new industries, including carbon harvesting, carbon burial, or just carbon sinks. And the forestry industry is an obvious place to go to for that remedy. So now, the economics starts to join the politics and the social aspect. I think it is a fascinating question that you've asked, Phil. It's fascinating because the answers aren't clear. They are multi-dimensional and they change. I have teenage children, and I was speaking to them just 2 days ago at Sunday breakfast about this thing called the singularity. And we are on the cusp of the singularity, where machines get the processing power of people. That doesn't mean machines replace people, but it means machines have the capacity to process with the equivalence of people. That means incredibly powerful machines. And what would that world look like post the singularity? What would it mean for society? What would it mean for political arrangements? What would it mean for family arrangements? And what would it mean for economic and industrial? And to put some context to that, how on earth could the singularity have some type of social or political outcome? Well, I'll choose perhaps an animated or even an obtuse example. What if machines, or not what if, machines increasingly can study our social media behavior? And by a machine studying our social media behavior, they know what time we go to sleep, when we wake up, what words amplify us, what words discourage us. They have machines that are now trawling social media looking for signs of depression, and machines can then actually intervene with what historically, traditionally, we would left in the hands of parents or family to identify depression. Now machines can identify it and can flag it to others. And then the human can intervene, saying, here's my sense, here's my concern. This is informed by machine, by big data and machine learning. That's the machine influencing society or the family and people. The machine could also influence politics. Because machines gather up, and we've seen some bad examples or raw examples of this. Think of the US elections, where social media was heavily engaged. Do I show too much of a political hand if I say and caused or influenced? But there's no mistaking it. The machine was involved in politics, trying to influence voters. And in Venezuela, people who have social media accounts have taken down their profiles where they associate to an external person, because Venezuela, as a failed state, one of the sources of revenue has become taking people hostage, kidnapping. And if you know that a person is on social media and connected mainly to a US dollar social media account, then there's your hostage, there's your kidnap target. So there's so many different ways, shapes and forms in which this starts to influence and color the social, political and economic environment. I don't think we can talk about one without talking about the other. And then, pausing for breath, that's the global. What do we do about South Africa? What does it mean for South Africa? What should we point to in terms of the social, the political, and then I have to, in the same fashion, bring in the economic. Perhaps I'll go out on a limb and make a couple of suggestions. The first is, where I described South Africa economically as a small open economy, let me try and do the same thing with South Africa socially. That socially we are young, we are unequal, and we are unemployed. This is a toxic cocktail. This is a very, very dangerous social cocktail. Those three elements that I've identified were the ingredients to the Arab Spring. Yeah. And when those Middle East and North African economies went into the Arab Spring, They were more equal than South Africa. They had lower levels of employment than South Africa, and they were slightly older. In other words, South Africa has those elements of young, unemployed, and unequal in an even more lethal or toxic cocktail than the Arab Spring. This has to be the single biggest concern, problem, consideration for policymakers, for business, for citizens. No one is immune to this. It is the single biggest country risk and challenge, is squaring up to that social cocktail. I think it is. I think it's callous, but I need to sort of empty my head with this thought. When I finish the sentence and say, there's nothing new about this. South Africa has been this way for a long time, and why I'm concerned that it's callous is, does that mean that, oh well, if it's been that way, it can carry on that way. Nothing to see here, folks. Move on. But this is one of the social constraints that binds South Africa. And unless South Africa addresses that toxic cocktail, we will remain trapped in this environment and run a very high risk of being taken to a lesser environment, a worse environment, more unequal, lower per capita incomes, even higher levels of unemployment. And that takes us in the direction of a failed state. Now that's, I think, adventuring too far onto the limb. South Africa is a long, long way from a failed state. We are a struggling state. We are battling with real problems, but we should remove reference to failed state. Failed state is South Sudan. Failed state is Venezuela, where there are no institutions, where the only thing that will get you a result, the only thing that will get you a result is politics and financial connection. And yes, there are aspects of that in South Africa, but if you think that they are bad, take a trip to South Sudan, to Somalia, to Venezuela. Those are failed states. South Africa is troubled, challenged, but not failed. And so that's, I think, one aspect that we really need to be clear on. And the environment that I would, or the country that I would parallel us to in thinking about our political and economic arrangements is Argentina. I think we are very Argentinian, that we have loads of capacity and potential and latent prospect. We punch below our weight, and we've been dragging our problems around for a long time. So that's the importance, the urgency of the structural reform. I'm going to start a sentence and say I'm not a political analyst, which means I'm about to venture a political opinion. Here we go. Here's an economist having a go at politics. In this social arrangement, I think it is very hard to see the ruling party hang on to the arrangement that it has had for the last 30 years. That a young, unemployed, unequal society will become increasingly jaundiced and jaded, and they will do one of two things if that young, unequal, unemployed stays entrenched. They will either stop political engagement, which is a very, very real risk to democracy. They'll just step out, or they will vote for something radical. They will vote for something spectacularly different. I don't need to veil, my references here. I think it's fairly transparent what I think these risks are. So then, then the economics and is driving the politics, and it would quickly become a case of that new political arrangement doing our adventure material economic damage.
Okay.
South Africa has to square up urgently to these structural reforms. This is the work of the ANC administration. There is no other job.
Thanks, Adrian. A really great comprehensive response there. And I must say thank you for bringing in some of the technology issues and what we could see, be it artificial intelligence to augmented reality, machine learning, just fantastic. Adrian, you mentioned you're a politician, but in your Gibbs role, you've spoken widely on current policy issues impacting South Africa. But are you anticipating any major economic or investment policy changes for South Africa in the next 10 to 15 years?
Can I give you the economist's answer? It depends. And yes, we should anticipate meaningful policy change, but importantly, not framework change. South Africa has. Let me try and reverse out of that answer. I need to qualify it. I'm anticipating policy impact, not so that's what I mean by policy change. A lot of the policy that has been put in place has not had impact. Right. It has been unimpactful because here's the policy, and lovely policy, carry on as you were. And we've seen this under South Africa's. The RDP wasn't really policy. The RDP was framework. Yeah. But we saw it under GEAR. We saw it under SISA. We then saw it under the NGP and more recently the NDP. Even Tito Mbowene's 77-pager and the Economic Recovery Plan all have the same framework. They all have the same structure, that it is about a capable state. It is about a state that works with the private sector. And please, I want to be absolutely clear here. There is a fundamental difference between the state and government. Government is the people we vote for and elect. State are the organs and institutions that get the stuff done. Eskom is not government. Eskom is state. SAA is state. Transnet is state. It is not government. And so what we're looking for in that framework is a capable state and a coherent state. In other words, a state that works in collaboration, in partnership with the private sector. I've been banging on about the state. Let me be very clear also. The private sector has a lot of work cut out here. Yeah. And I think 4 things are called for from the private sector. I've sort of lost my thought on what are the policy interventions, but so that's what I want. I suspect that under the political arrangement, we can anticipate this type of policy framework. The policy change that we urgently need is that policy promise to turn into policy delivery. Yeah. Part of that policy delivery requires the capable state. In the same breath, that policy delivery requires an engaged and participating private sector. And the private sector needs to do a number of things on this front. I'm not going to try and count them before I say them. So let me just tip them out of my head. The first thing that the private sector needs to do is to get out of the investment drought and to take their hands out of their pockets and put them into their wallets and purses and invest in the South African economy. We have been on an investment boycott for a decade, and it is the private sector that has been boycotting, not the public sector. The second thing that the private sector needs to do is to remember the participation, or to recognize and acknowledge the participation in uncompetitive practices and in state capture. the private sector has not been an innocent bystander. There are parts of the private sector that have been willing participants in this dangerous cocktail. That has to be remedied and reversed. So when I'm talking about people need to go to jail, we need orange overalls. This is not just pointing to government. This is pointing to the broad basket of participants in state capture. And if anything, it is even more non-public sector rather than public sector. The third element is if you have a young, unemployed, unequal society, you have to make it your industrial work in modeling a business, in thinking about the business model that you bring to South Africa. How is that going to build on South Africa's young, unequal, unemployed? How are we going to turn that from a disadvantage to an advantage? How are we going to turn that Achilles heel to our competitive strength? A company example I think might be worthwhile just going to as an illustrator or a case in point. One of my favorite company examples here is the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. Why I give this? Well, first, why talk about another country and another company? Because it removes all of our bias and our judgment. So we can get onto the balcony, we can let go of the politics and our judgment, and let's talk about Bangladesh, which much of this audience will know little about, and the Grameen Bank, which even fewer will know anything about. So here's a company that is born in an environment that is overwhelmingly male-dominated, and women are excluded from the economy. It is born in a Bangladesh that is one of the poorest countries in the world, with little industry to talk of, mainly an agricultural economy, and very, very high levels of poverty and economic disengagement, especially biased against women. Along comes the Grameen Bank, and the Grameen Bank makes funding available to women. And interestingly, some of the first loans that were made by the Grameen Bank, because of the social, or because of the cultural practice that women and men are not able to engage under Islam in Bangladesh, you had bankers, loan officers sitting outside of the home, talking through the wall to the woman inside of the home, making, setting up funding arrangements for women to help them participate in the economy. The second is, with women economically disengaged and financially disenfranchised, the Grameen Bank starts making lending available to women with a couple of interesting business model components. The first is the loan would only be made available if it was for investment in improving the home, education, or building a business. This is what you would call productive capital, not consumptive capital, i.e. flat screen television or curtains. It's productive capital investments. The next thing that they did in the business model that's absolutely fascinating is they said you could only get a business loan if you had passed a financial literacy test, and to keep that loan alive, you have to keep passing the financial literacy test. In other words, there is ongoing adult education in financial literacy. Can you imagine the risks that you remove and the capability that you build by ensuring that people have financial literacy before they sign up for a loan? The other element that I think is just absolutely transformative is they only make loans to women. They do not lend to men. And for a woman to be granted a loan, she has to form a syndicate, a loan syndicate. And then the Grameen Bank will make a loan to the group of women, not to one person, to 5 people. And that syndicate is then responsible for the loan, i.e. the syndicate will only take on the loan if they collectively agree that this loan is worth taking. And this is the power of community, society. It shows transformative culture. And today, the Grameen Bank boasts one of the lowest rates of non-performing loans in the world. They do not have a credit committee. No one vets or screens loans. That's a transformative business model. And I would venture that that's the type of thinking that South African businesses need to get on with. And as much as I'm urging policymakers to get on with urgent policy reform, South African business needs to get on with urgent practice and business model reform.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm just thinking, in our industry, we always talk about bringing appropriate technology to South Africa. We never talk about bringing appropriate business models. You've opened my eyes a bit. Fantastic. Really great. Adrian, you've answered a number of several issues that you really answered very well. But are there any topics that you mentioned that you believe we have to consider and will have potential impact in the transport sector in particular?
Yeah, I mean, what a great question, Phil. The transport sector is I'm thinking critical, but I need to change that word. It is an absolutely fundamental component of a competitive and inclusive economy. There is no economy that has become productive, sustainably competitive, successful without a viable transport sector. It is an absolutely fundamental component. Having made that statement, that sector, of course, is multidimensional, with businesses of different shapes and forms, businesses of different sizes, and it requires a couple of different things. It requires a massive investment in infrastructure and architecture, absolutely massive investment. South Africa is underinvested in infrastructure, and we need to take on a very, very big infrastructure bill. And that needs to be funded sustainably. Here's where I'll rewind to one of my earlier points about the depth and sophistication of South African capital markets. This is a key component to building South Africa's infrastructure bed. Now to turn myself into, or put myself into your heads and hats, thinking of which parts of the industry are likely to translate into the biggest gains in competitive advantage. I think that there are two components. The one is rail transport, which in many places is geographically very, very difficult, but we are underinvested in rail. That is low-hanging fruit. And the second is in public transport, which is industrially tricky because the way in which public sector transport has now shaped itself. But public sector transport in South Africa, because of the urban geography, is expensive and inefficient. And I think that those are, if you were to put me into the policy suite and allowed me to make two big changes, those would be the first two that I would get on with immediately, trying to square up how we solve those, Phil. Those all require big investments into physical infrastructure, gross domestic fixed investment, and the beauty, the elegance, the power of gross domestic fixed investment is it has big linkages, economic linkages, that they have backward linkages, i.e., it requires cement, concrete, aggregate, rebar, reinforced steel, explosives, etc., etc. So there are backward linkages, and there are also what we would call forward linkages, that once this is built, it translates into transport efficiencies, maintenance of transport equipment, and so on. So these industries have very powerful, important spillover, multiplier, and linkage effects, which then starts to shift into the addressing economic exclusion and inequality. So the transport sector at a very broad level has two powerful roles to play. The one is just building economic infrastructure, as an architect of economic capability. The second is it has the capacity to be transformative.
Thank you, Adrian. Makes sense to us in the industry, and really great answer. Adrian, before we end off, are there any other issues you may want to add? Something that you think we may have left out?
Well, I suppose, in closing out our conversation, there's three things that I'd like to really encourage, and hopefully, perhaps, this discussion encourages it. The first is, many people regard economics as being something that happens out there, that it's alien and foreign. I hope that this conversation has made some aspect of economics accessible, possibly even interesting, but you can dress it up any way you like, or you can imagine it any way you like. The single most important thing for your business's performance and for the direction of travel of your family and your household earnings and your company profitability is what's going on outside the room, what's going on in the economy. If I give you a 10% economic growth economy, I have just given your business the most magnificent opportunity, 10% economic growth, and it will translate into new jobs and higher incomes for your workforce. The economy truly matters. And it's important that we use conversations like this to build economic literacy and economic engagement. The second thing is, as much as economics is important, we don't have to invent the wheel here. We can go and learn from what has been done in other places. For the last 12 years, I've been involved in a project surveying 160 countries, covering 60 years of their economic and social experience. And we find a small set of common ingredients in countries that successfully transition and transform. And I would encourage us in thinking about what's possible for South Africa or any other country for that matter, to go and learn from the successes of places as different and varied as Chile, South Korea, Hungary, Poland, Estonia, Taiwan. What have they done that has been so successful? And it boils down to a small set of common ingredients. Two of them we've touched on in this conversation without me mentioning them explicitly. The first is policy coherence and policy stability. The second is an engaged public-private partnership that translates into high levels of investment, and in particular, fixed investment in infrastructure. So that's the second thing, to learn from those examples of success. The third is that none of this matters for anyone in this room unless it translates into action. Otherwise, this was just a really interesting conversation. I mean, I really enjoyed talking to you. You've done more listening than, but I've really enjoyed the chance to tip out my head and share my thoughts. But none of this matters unless it turns to action.
On that point, Adrian, I could carry on here listening to you for many, many hours, even if it is about economics as well. You've really made it really interesting. There have been some fascinating insights and issues. And I just want to say, look, on behalf of the Technology Foresight project team, thank you for sharing your insightful views, which have been backed up with excellent, experience, some great examples. So just thanks a million for spending the time with me today.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to welcome our eminent futures thinker, Dr. Andre Roux. Dr. Roo served as director of the Institute for Futures Research at the University of Stellenbosch and is currently the program head of postgraduate programs and the head of the Future Studies at the Business School at the University of Stellenbosch, where he lectures on economics. Dr. Roo has taught on various executive education programs across South Africa and internationally in countries including Australia, Belgium, Mauritius, Namibia, Swaziland, Tanzania, Ghana, and Nigeria. He serves as a guest lecturer on postgraduate programs at the School of Public Management, Stellenbosch, and also postgraduate diploma in managing HIV and AIDS in the workplace. Dr. Roo holds a PhD in economics, and his areas of expertise include business and labor economics. His research focuses on globalization and socio-economic development in Africa, and he's responsible for more than 150 publications. Andre, really impressive career, great background in economics and futures thinking. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your views on South Africa's future scenarios and the discussion that emanates.
Thank you. Hello, everybody.
Great. My first question for you then relates to global trends. Obviously, South Africa doesn't operate in a vacuum, and global trends and development play a major role, either for better or for worse. And it's just the way our country's landscape evolves. In your view, what are some of the really big global trends that are expected to unfold over the next few years?
Thank you, Phil, and good day to everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. I think it's important that we should always consider the fact that, as you pointed out, we do not know and operate in a vacuum. No country, no entity, no household for that matter. And perhaps just to drive home that point, let's have a look at the well-known approach, the so-called pestle analysis, because that gives us a background context to what we want to talk about. So it's well known to everybody. You can imagine, you can kind of visualize in your mind's eye that any entity is influenced by a whole range of what we could call contextual forces. These include, well known to all of us, things such as the economic environment. Moving clockwise, we have the physical environment, natural resources, the technological environment, institutional, political environment, the social environment. All of these in their own right are a mouthful. But the way we need to think about society and its future is along the following lines. And that is that if we take infrastructure, road infrastructure as a pertinent example, that it permeates, it influences every one of these environments and is influenced by every one of these. So we're starting to see the emergence already of a really integrated, almost spider's web of interactions. There is my metaphorical spider's web. They all interact with one another. But more than that, we have to consider the fact that we have to understand these things from not only a local perspective, but also a global perspective. As I said earlier, no one operates in a vacuum. We're part and parcel of the global reality. So it makes sense when looking at the future of any country and any entity to at least have make some passing nod to some of the global trends to which we are not immune. And I'd like to quickly talk about 9 such global trends. A bit of a gimmick here. I'm using the word Foresight, which is appropriate, where each letter stands for a particular trend. So very quickly, and well known to most of us, we can say that what the first important trend is the 4th Industrial Revolution. A revolution in the sense it's changing and is set to change not only how we think about doing business, but also the role of human beings, for better or for worse. The letter O stands for Oriental, which is really my kind of proxy for a very clear shift, a power shift, an economic power shift from the West to the rest, from the developed to the developing world. We see, for instance, that 5 of the world's 10 largest economies actually come from the so-called developing world. And we also see that purchasing power is shifting very rapidly to places such as China and other developing countries. The growth of the middle income society in those countries is literally phenomenal. Then, of course, rewriting the economic paradigm. If we think about it, this year is barely 21 years old in a few days. And yet already in this decade, in this century, we've experienced two of the worst economic recessions in living memory, with all kinds of economic and political backlashes. On a more positive note, if we take a slightly longer view back into history, we note that individuals all over the world are becoming more empowered in terms of things such as education, access to internet, access to mobile phones, medical care, vastly improved compared to 20, 30 years ago. But unfortunately, we know this point, because of this, ironically, because of this massive growth in middle-income consumers with middle-income tastes, there's a huge pressure, a growing pressure on our already limited resources. Sustainability is no longer just a topic discussed by those on the fringe. And despite major progress in combating poverty, and just by the way, in the last 25 years, the number of people on this globe living in poverty has declined faster and more significantly than ever before. And yet, inequality is alive and well on this planet. And in some parts of the world, especially the developed world, the graying of populations, the aging of populations has become a real thing, a really worrying thing. In Europe, for instance, since 2010, there have been more people older than 64 than children younger than 15. And this is putting increasing pressure on labor forces, pressure on pension funds and the like. And of course, we all know about climate change, the world getting hotter and drier. And ironically, Africa, which is probably least responsible for climate change, is probably going to be worst affected by climate change. And ending off on a far more positive note, and linking up to the first point in some ways, access to tele-everything, telemedicine, tele-education. And this is, again, a major change, a major trend shift, as it were. So all of these things, and probably many more, are some of the big issues which are shaping the way in which the world and society is developing. The exact way they're going to unfold, we obviously don't know. Well, and how they're going to unfold in different countries might differ. We can say, however, that all of these, in conjunction with one another, are changing the future landscape. And the world of tomorrow is not going to be the same as the world of today, and certainly not the same as the world of yesterday. Thanks, Will.
Andre, thank you very much for that comprehensive response relating to some of the global issues and trends that will affect South Africa. If we now bring it closer to home and we look at our domestic economy, for example, it's been in the doldrums for more than a decade. Can you just touch on some of the major causes and effects of this?
Sure. I think it might be worthwhile just kicking off very quickly with a bit of history, just to put things into context. I put together this rather odd-looking diagram, perhaps initially, which shows us two forces. So from left to right, it looks at socioeconomic development, which ranges from low to high. And then from bottom to top, or top to bottom, we have democratization, also ranging from low to high. And if we look at the period roughly 20 years before 1994, the bottom left-hand side, I think we will all agree that was a period in our history characterized by a low level of socioeconomic development. There might have been some, but it was very exclusive and not inclusive, and obviously a very low level of democracy. So well-known unfortunate realities such as segregation, white dominance, very high inequality, high levels of poverty, international ostracization. We were the skunks of the world. And along with that, economic stagnation, per capita growth was falling, investment falling, inflation was sky high, interest rates were sky high, and our foreign exchange reserves were abysmally low. Obviously, in 1994, things changed, and for the next few years, the outlook was far brighter. But if we have a look at the last, let's say, 10 years or so, then unfortunately we find ourselves in a situation where, sure, democracy is in a much better place. We have a progressive constitution, a Bill of Rights, free and fair elections. We have the end of politically inspired isolation, but unfortunately that is not being matched on the economic side. Growth is low. Unemployment is, as we all know, exceptionally high. Poverty remains high. Inequality, despite everything, still remains exceptionally high, arguably the highest in the world. So it's this top left-hand corner that we need to be concerned about. So just very quickly, just a few thoughts in this regard, many of which again are well known to all of us. First of all, if we have a look at, sorry, that's just going one too quick. I think it's important that South Africans should be aware of the fact that the structure of our economy has changed. Gone are the days where the backbone of this economy was simply mining and agriculture. I'm talking about the pink line on this graph. Yes, it's still important, but a mere 10% of our total economy. Meanwhile, services, that's the yellow line, accounts for 70% of our economy. We are at a place today where, for instance, the financial services sector is more than double the size of mining and agriculture put together and employs more people. The same goes for things such as tourism and even our sports economy in normal circumstances is about the same size as our gold economy. There's been a fundamental shift in what we produce in the economy. And I don't think that everyone has realized that. I think many people still expect and hope that mining and agriculture will be the backbone and come to our salvation. Of course, we also know that after reaching a fairly decent 5 to 6% growth rate about 15 years ago, that ever since then, economic growth has been on the decline. And I think an important point is that even before the onset of COVID, these are quarterly growth figures, even before the onset of COVID, we had already recorded an official textbook recession. I want to repeat that. We entered a recession even before COVID hit us. Obviously, COVID hit us very hard. Economic growth in 2020, -7%, -8%. A recovery last year, but nonetheless, the economic growth trend is a downward one. And we need to point out that most experts will agree that to really achieve some kind of major improvement in unemployment and the like, we need a growth rate of around about 5 to 6%. We're far, far away from that. So obviously, we ask ourselves, what's gone wrong? Before I get to that, just another interesting observation made, and that is it could take South Africa until the end of 2024 to return to our pre-pandemic GDP per capita. That's quite a long time, and even then, that's not all that great. So what's gone wrong? Well, I don't want to talk about all of these things in gory detail, but we could argue that we have become guilty, for lack of a better word, of becoming a nation of deficits. We can talk about a surplus of deficits, whether that be government spending well in excess of tax revenue and therefore rapidly rising levels of government debt. And just an interesting point here, just to put this in perspective, the amount of interest that government is now paying on its government debt is more than double the size of the entire Namibian economy. It is double the size of the contribution made by, or not quite double, but bigger than the contribution made by our construction sector. That's just the interest government's paying on government debt. And when I say government's paying, of course, you and I are paying as taxpayers. Talking about you and I, for more than 10 years, households in this country have been spending more than they're earning, which means that savings, the country's savings performance is really exceptionally low. And because of that, there aren't enough funds to finance much needed investment. We import more than we export. Thankfully, at the same time, we seem to manage to attract foreign investment, which cancels out that deficit. but nonetheless, it makes us very vulnerable. Another well-known deficit, there are more job seekers than there are job opportunities. Everyone would have seen that our unemployment rate now is close to 35%, particularly for young people. The youth unemployment rate is in excess of 60%. One of the reasons for that is a skills deficit. And this brings us back to what I said a bit earlier about the changing structure of our economy. We have a services-driven economy, unfortunately, for all kinds of reasons, going back many, many years. A large proportion of adults in this country do not have the fundamental basic education requirements to take up jobs in a services-driven economy. It's actually rather frightening to note that about 1/4, 24% of adults in this country, or only 24%, have a grade 12 or higher education. We could almost say that given the nature of the economy, most jobs require at least 12 years of education. And you haven't got 12 years of education, it's almost like saying you haven't got your driver's license, your learner's license. You can't even get into the job market. Obviously, we're concerned about ESCOM. That's perhaps the biggest short-term concern at the moment. Every now and again, water deficits. You could argue there's a trust deficit. Social capital, social cohesion is rather flimsy at the moment. An institutional deficit. Institutions are important. And I just want to sort of quickly fast forward on this point, because it's worthwhile, I think, pursuing. And that is to have a look at the importance of institutions. We're talking here about institutions such as the Public Protector, the Reserve Bank, the Auditor General, the media, the judiciary. And it's a well-known fact, and I will get there, that our institutions are in a spot of bother. Just have a look at this, international research. It shows us the link between GDP per capita and then some measure of institutional quality. And we find very simply that no rich countries have poor institutions and no poor countries have good institutions. So the link is loud and clear. And in South Africa, according to the latest available survey done by the World Economic Forum, over the last number of years, this country's ranking regarding various institutional elements has declined dramatically. The one that always catches my eyes right at the top, the strength of auditing and reporting standards. For many years, we were ranked number 1 in the world. As you can see, that ranking has plummeted. There's been a slight improvement of late, but nonetheless, clear evidence our institutional performance is lacking, and institutions matter. And then finally, despite being the 32nd biggest economy, let's repeat that, out of 218 countries, South Africa's economy is the 32nd biggest in the world. We are not a trivial economy. But despite that, our human development performance is less impressive. Yes, it has started improving. What you see there is the Human Development Index. But it's perhaps sobering to see that our development performance is below that of Mauritius and more or less on par with Gabon. So we could almost say we are underperforming. We're punching below our weight when it comes to more systemic human development. So to summarize everything, the biggest single fundamental reason for a poorly performing economy is too many deficits which are simply unsustainable. You see there in red a graph indicating at a global level an inverse relationship between economic growth and debt. All right, thank you, Paul.
All right, thank you. Made a big case for the change in our structural economy. Really interesting to see what financial services now contribute. You've made the point around our adult education, not being able to cope in this changing environment. You mentioned some of the growth rates of 5 to 6%. I want to ask you a question here. Do you think, taking all of that into account, are we a failed economy? What does it say about some of our policy issues? If you could comment on those two points, I'd appreciate it.
You know, I tend to be perhaps naively optimistic, but carefully so. The way I like to put it is that, and I hope what I'm saying makes some kind of sense, that the fact that we're barely growing at 1% these days, perhaps 2 or 3% this year, but back to 2% next year, is disappointing in the sense that we could be doing so much better. To me, that is a big failure. We are still, in the broadest sense of the word, a meaningful economy. As I said, 32nd biggest, very good financial institutions, very good innovation, etc. So in many ways, a solid economy, which is sadly underperforming. So I wouldn't say we're a failed economy. I think we are just flattering to deceive. We are a disappointing economy. We could be doing so much better. I'd rather be saying this, by the way, that we could be doing so much better than saying this is it, this is the best we can do.
Sure.
I hope that makes some kind of sense.
No, it definitely does. And Andre, your view on the 5 and 6%, is that achievable?
Again, speaking now as someone who's not only an economist but a futures thinker, never say never. But realistically, I don't think in the next few years. You know, as futurists, we like using scenarios to take a look at how a country or an entity can unfold. And maybe it's appropriate now to share with you a few scenarios that may in some way answer your question.
Right.
So I think just to introduce that, I want to take you back to this slide I showed you earlier, pointing out that we find ourselves in the top left-hand corner at the moment. Obviously, ideally, we'd like to be in the top right-hand corner, the best of both worlds, with a more inclusive level of socioeconomic development, and along with that, retaining our democratic desires and the like. So the big question really is, will we get there? And if so, how will we get there? And this is where a scenario little exercise could be useful. And I want to make it as, you know, as not as simple as possible, but as quick as possible, by perhaps suggesting that right now, as you look forward, we have a number of tipping points, or if you like, we're at a moment of truth. I've got 6, some of which I've indirectly mentioned already. And then we could actually pose these in the form of questions. So, will we succeed in the years that lie ahead in becoming more competitive in the global economy? Because whether we like it or not, in a global economy, in the midst of globalization, you need to be able to compete. Firstly, to access bigger markets for your exports, but also to reduce your reliance on imports. So it's about competing. It's also about producing the right kind of goods for the export market and producing them at a competitive price. Secondly, how will we deal with that democratic surplus I just referred to? We have lots of democracy, nowhere near enough economic development. That means there's a mismatch, a disequilibrium between democracy and the economy. Thirdly, what's going to happen to our stock of social capital? Social capital cohesion is crucial. Even the World Bank and many others will agree with this. Social capital is the glue that puts things together. It's about tolerance and goodwill and the like. Fourthly, obviously, will we generate sufficient skills and the right kind of skills? Fifthly, will we generate sufficient savings? Always very boring. Savings is a bit of a, you know, who likes savings? It's very boring. But you need savings. A country needs savings to finance investment. Investment in machinery and equipment and infrastructure. Will our democratic institutions retain their autonomy? It used to be a hallmark of the post-94 South Africa. We're proud of our autonomous democratic institutions. Because of state capture and the like, some of that autonomy and or competence has been eroded. And finally, we have a young population. Unlike Europe, unlike Japan, unlike China, a fairly young population, which could be our biggest asset, or if not managed correctly, a major liability. Will we manage to exploit the potential benefits of having such a young population and a growing labor force? So these are the tipping points. Now, using one or two techniques in future studies, we find that of these 7 tipping points, 2 in particular are crucial. We could call these pivotal factors, in the sense that if those 2 highlighted in red, if those 2 are properly leveraged and tweaked, then many of the others will directly or indirectly also be positively affected. The 2 are that autonomy of institutions, and then generating sufficient and the right kind of skills. And we can now use those 2 to come up with a set of 4 scenarios. And it works as follows. So there you can see the horizontal axis describes 2 polar outcomes regarding skills. Let's say we're looking at the year 2030, 2035. So the skills level could range from being still inappropriate, low level, to on the right-hand side, competitive and high level. And the other one then is that institutional autonomy. So we could have further institutional decay, or we could have an institutional renaissance. And those 4 quadrants actually describe 4 very broad-based scenarios. So if we take a look at the top right-hand side, which I think intuitively is the most desirable one, we're talking about competitive skills and good institutions, gold at the end of the rainbow. Bottom left-hand side is the worst of both worlds. Their skills remain unsatisfactory, institutions go from bad to worse. That is a winter of discontent. Bottom right-hand side, there the skills are better, but our institutions are still in a mess. We could perhaps call that an Indian summer, just 1 or 2 days of glorious weather, even though it's winter. And the top left-hand side, there we have better institutions, but the skills level not all that great. Hope springs eternal. Of course, a description of each of these scenarios could take us a long, long time. So I'm just going to look at 2 of them. Let's start with the worst one, winter of discontent. That would be a South Africa where there's ongoing rent-seeking behavior. Politicians, senior business people try to extract from the system as much as they can, probably illegally, at the expense of the rest of us. Pockets of prosperity, vigilantes, a divided society, the Dutch disease, we continue to just export our raw material and import value-added goods. Growth is elitist. The skills and the digital divide get wider and wider. Government now starts panicking. Nothing's working. They decide, well, all we can do is throw money at the problem. But there is no money to throw at the problem. They have to borrow more and more. Government debt becomes uncontrollable. People start paying tax and the state loses control. Excuse me, the goal at the end of the rainbow would probably require some kind of social pact to enhance that social cohesion where all the stakeholders agree and compromise on various objectives. Crime should not be tolerated. We protect those institutions. There's more tolerance. There's more accountability. We leverage our natural resources because we can. We've got better skills and we add value. We become more competitive. We really don't just pay lip service to the idea of the importance of entrepreneurs. Self-employment is the fastest growing kind of employment on this planet. We need to not only foster that spirit, but actively encourage it. All of this results in a growing economy, which means a bigger tax base. And in this nice scenario, government spends its money in a sensible fashion. So there they are again. If you were to ask me where I think we'll be in 10 years' time, then maybe I am again going to express my naive optimism. But I think that we are going to make progress over the next 10 to 15 years in regard to our institutions. I think there is a strong chance we can restore that earlier pride we had in our institutions. So we could move up there. But even as a naive optimist, it would be difficult for me to say that we're going to solve all our education and skills problems within 10 years. I think we can make some progress, but I suspect in 10, 15 years' time we'll be somewhere here. Hope springs eternal, not the worst place to be. It means we're on the right track. Hope springs eternal. And in 20 years' time, I would like to think we would have moved more to the right, and we might find ourselves in this gold at the end of the rainbow. So kind of a long answer to your question, Phil, which was initially, can we achieve 5 or 6% growth? I think we can, but not in the next few years.
Fantastic answer, Andre. I really loved your analysis, taking us, to what could be socioeconomic outlook for South Africa in 2035, as you put it. And those two major pivotal points you mentioned, you think we'll make progress a lot quicker on the democratic institution and fixing those up?
I think so, yes. If you consider it education as a long-term project, as a wise old man once said, if you want someone with 12 years of education, guess what? It takes about 12 years. It is a long thing. It's not just about getting people educated, but making sure the education and skills are the right kind of skills. I'm going to be controversial now, but simply having an advanced degree doesn't guarantee a job. It's about the right kind of skills. In fact, I think sometimes we overemphasize going to university. It's important, obviously, but we just need just as desperately artisans, for instance. So it's about the right kind of skills, appropriate skills. Bearing in mind, as an added, I suppose, complication, but also challenge, with the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, the kind of skills we're going to need in 10 years' time are totally different to what we've become accustomed to. So it's about lifelong learning, literally. If I may just quickly make this point, I find it fascinating. Experts say that the kind of talents we're going to require in this Fourth Industrial Revolution are flexibility, so being able to adjust to new circumstances almost overnight, learning agility, so learning a new talent, a new skill, again, almost overnight, according to what the market requires. Thirdly, empathy, and fourthly, transdisciplinary thinking. In other words, although you might be an expert in, let's say, accounting, at the same time, you need to have more than just a nodding knowledge of philosophy. So those are the kind of talents. Learning agility, flexibility, empathy, and transdisciplinary thinking. So we have to keep up with that requirement as well, which is why I say I think the education one is a longer term project than restoring our institutional integrity and competence.
Thank you, Andre. Andre, turning a bit to the industry that most of us come from, transport. I'd like to know from your perspective, where does infrastructure and especially transport infrastructure fit into all of this? I'd love to hear your views.
All right. Bearing in mind I'm not a transport economist, but this might be useful to consider. It's well known, it's obvious. It's always nice to see that what we suspect might actually be true. So if you look on the left-hand side, there's a very bland statement. Infrastructure investment causes economic growth, and economic growth pushes up infrastructure investment. So the two go hand in hand. Investment in infrastructure and economic growth are two sides of the same coin. And that's proven by looking at this international research on the right-hand side, which shows very clearly a link between the share of investment in infrastructure in the GDP and economic growth. A very clear positive relationship. If we have a look at the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Report, now they rank 141 countries, the latest one, by looking at a whole host of indicators. Overall, South Africa ranked number 60th, built upon what they call 12 pillars of competitiveness. In the enabling environment, there are 4 pillars. The numbers you see here represent South Africa's ranking for each one of them. As you can see, the institutions ranked 55th, infrastructure number 69. Human capital split up into health and skills. There you can see we're not doing very well at all. Markets, including our labor market flexibility, our financial system, market size, and then finally innovation ecosystem, business dynamics and innovation capacity. Now, broadly speaking, if you move from bottom to top, you're kind of describing the level of economic development across the world. So typically, countries still at a low level of income would be focusing on getting the environment right. And then those making some progress would now be looking at human capital, and your advanced economies would be focusing on the innovation ecosystem. But please note the strange, almost irony here. And this, I think, in many ways does describe this fascinating country we all live in. So we see, for instance, that when it comes to things such as financial system, we rank number 19th in the world. Market size, 35th, and innovation capacity, 46th. So we're doing relatively well in areas which are normally associated with more advanced economies. When it comes to getting the basics right, well, health, 118th, skills, 90th, ICT adoption, 89th, and infrastructure, not all that wonderful, 69th. So again, I hope you can see almost the perverse situation. This is perhaps South Africa. This is what makes the country so challenging and so exciting. We're almost upside down, back to front, topsy-turvy. But I want to focus now on infrastructure, because that in turn is split up into 2 major areas: transport infrastructure and utility infrastructure. And again, the numbers there indicate our ranking out of 141. So road connectivity, 7th best in the world. Quality of road infrastructure, 47th best in the world. Okay, as you can see, the rest relate to railways and airports and shipping. Utility infrastructure, the one that jumps out, of course, is electricity access, 107th in the world, which is perhaps not a big surprise. But the point is that in comparative terms, when it comes to road infrastructure, we're actually not doing too badly. 7th and 47th for those 2 that refer to connectivity and quality. But that said, I then did a few quick calculations, and sometimes, of course, one is confronted by a lack of the exact data you're looking for, but we can do this. This is gross fixed capital formation, the new fancy word for investment, fixed investment in economic infrastructure. This is in real terms, going back to 1960, and obviously, not surprisingly, from the mid-70s to the early 90s, that collapsed. There was no appetite, for various reasons, to invest in economic infrastructure. After that, of course, with normalization of society, it jumped up quite handsomely. In the last few years, declining again. We see a similar thing by looking at the same number as a share of the GDP. There you can see plummeting to barely 2%, recovering to 5%, but now subsiding again to about, what, 3%. So what we're seeing here is, oh dear, sorry, that's the joys of living at home and dogs barking. What we see here is a marked recovery, but then in more recent times, a drop. But this is simply the year-to-year actual investment in infrastructure. What's perhaps more important is, what does our stock of economic infrastructure look like? What is our fixed capital stock in economic infrastructure? And here the news is perhaps a bit better. After stagnating for many years, it has now jumped quite significantly. And I thought, just for the fun of it, let's see what this turns out to be per capita. with a similar kind of trend. So the per capita stock of economic infrastructure, of course includes roads, fell in the bad old days and has since recovered. So mixed messages here, and obviously these are just numbers, this is just money, it says nothing about quality. But perhaps I can end off with the following thoughts. The National Intelligence Commission, an American think tank, which consults all over the world and comes up with all kinds of fascinating things, was actually talking, amongst other things, about a growing middle income and rapid urbanization in the developing world. Please note that.
Yeah.
So Asia, Africa, South America. And these words are phenomenal. As a result of rapid urbanization in the developing world, and here come the amazing words, the volume of urban construction for housing, for office space, for transport services over the next 40 years would roughly equal the entire volume of such construction to date in world history. I can't always get my mind around this, but it sounds like a big number. So it does certainly mean that the market is there, the opportunities are there for rapid and huge investments in infrastructure. Is the capacity there? Well, of course, that's another question. And I just thought might find interesting to support this. I managed to find these photographs of Shanghai, and it's supposed to be the same district in Shanghai in 1990, then in 2010, and the same district a couple of years ago looking like that. Just bearing out this idea of this huge demand for all kinds of economic infrastructure, including roads, over the next number of decades. And that, Phil, is my story.
Thank you, Andre. Can I just ask, I mean, great example on the urbanization front, and what could happen in the next 10 to 15 years. Any thoughts of increasing regional integration here in Africa and what that could do to,
Sure,
you know, infrastructure and investment?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think just as, excuse me, I said at the beginning, we need to look at the globe, obviously at a regional level, Africa, and we have recent developments, of course, the African Free Trade Agreement, which, if all goes according to plan, is supposed to enhance more than ever before integration of economies and countries and the like. So yes, I think Africa has huge scope, and we all know the story. We all know that economic infrastructure in Africa is way behind, is lagging way behind, but the scope is there. I mean, we can quote all kinds of little anecdotal stories, such as there are some countries in Central Africa where food is being grown on farms, and yet people in neighboring villages are starving to death because up to 1/3 of the food being produced rots on the fields because there's no way of getting the food to the neighboring villages. There's no roads whatsoever. We can talk about railroad. I mean, many railway systems in Africa seem to be fragmented. They start and end in the middle of nowhere. We can talk about sea freight and harbors, etc. So yes, I mean the demand in Africa is probably more pressing, with many positive spin-offs than most other parts of the world. And one would like to see South Africa playing a major role in that. Not because we want to come across as being Big Brother, but simply because of expertise and skills and the like.
Andre, you've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, a lot of information to help us shape our desired future. But before we end off, are there any other issues you may want to add?
You know, I think perhaps just a bit of pop psychology 101. When people discover that I call myself sometimes a futurist, you can imagine the first question they ask is, well, what lies ahead in the future? And my response is very often, well, what would you like the future to look like? What I'm trying to say there is that we far too easily, as individuals, as entities, as institutions, sort of sit back and wait for things to happen. And we often expect the worst to happen. Whereas in actual fact, we should be thinking about a more desired future, what would we like to happen, and working accordingly. Because if we all think the worst is going to happen, then in a strange way, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it's important, any institution, as I say, household, individual, government, you name it, should also contemplate and consider a desired future and work towards that. And perhaps a very final point, I'm not saying this because of the audience that we'll be talking to now, but it's been shown over and over again that appropriate investment in economic infrastructure is an important enabling factor, a co-creator of bringing about better economic growth, job creation, development, and the like. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, certainly, as I said, a lot of food for thought there. You know, on behalf of the Technology Foresight project team, thank you for sharing your insightful views, which have been backed up with some really excellent slides. And of course, your broad experience comes into play. So thank you for spending time with me today.
Thank you, and good luck with the rest of the exercise.
Thanks, Andre. Yeah, some interesting and fascinating insights from our eminent thinkers. Once again, thank you to Dr. Seville, Dr. Roux, for their valued participation. Please don't forget to pose your questions, comments on the chat box, which will be answered in a blog. And we'll also include the comments, obviously, from the additional experts. They'll have their inputs. Note that the webinar recordings will be available also on a YouTube channel afterwards. The details regarding access to the recordings, the blog, and the YouTube channel will be emailed to all of you. And the details will also be posted on the SANRAL website. So if you're a bit worried you haven't received an email, just have a look at the SANRAL website for those linkages. I must say it's exciting to see some of the questions that have already been posed in the chat box. Some of them, let me just look at some of them here, from Professor Amadi Chendu to Adrian Seville. Adrian, do subscribe to the suggestions to replace GDP, GNP measurements with metrics of indicating genuine progress, perhaps a genuine progress indication. Here's a comment from Mark Zeitgeist. It's a very interesting discussion. It says the informal sector in South Africa is significant at nearly 20% of GDP and jobs. What is the prospect of the new technologies you spoke about, and this was to Adrian, bringing positive change to this often forgotten and ignored informal sector? And here's a comment from Steph Bridnam. Steph, and it's to Professor Seville. He says Eskom's financial report does not show that renewables are cheaper than coal. I acknowledge that a lot of the coal infrastructure has been paid and therefore skew the finances, but that is how it is reported. Renewables need a base load, and strategically nuclear is the best option. Unfortunately, that's a big no-no in South Africa. I do support renewables. However, we have to be realistic. The break-even point between electric vehicle and conventional vehicles is 60,000 kilometers, and it won't come for free. Renewables will, and are creating a new infrastructure need, but a wider input is required. And then there's a comment here to Professor Roux, and it's from Elaine Gooden, but also asking questions around SANRAL and its mandate. It says, does SANRAL's mandate allow opportunities to contribute to the development of public transportation? And also, does SANRAL have a training budget on construction projects? How sustainable are the skills that the workers learn? Can they apply it after the project is completed? Does it make people more employable? And Elaine mentioned that when she works on site, the contractor viewed it as a checklist, not a means to improve the future employability of local workers. So we'll get the comments from SANRAL on that. It's so important, you know, if you think about the issues that Andre raised regarding talents and appropriate skills and flexibility. Now, please note the second webinar in the series of 3 is scheduled for Monday. Monday afternoon, the 9th of May, from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. It'll be focused on future scenarios for South Africa and the local transport aspects. And we've got 2 eminent thinkers, and they'll be Dr. Yaki Salir from the Institute for Security Studies and Mr. Nazir Ali, the President of the World Roads Congress, PIAC. We will be having the 3rd webinar, which will focus on international transport drives and trends on Wednesday, the 11th of May. That's next week from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock. And there, the eminent thinkers will include Ms. Susanna Zapatero, the Director General of the International Road Federation, and Mr. Mike Pittman from the Futures Group of the UK Department for Transport. Please note that the invite you received includes the invite to the second and third webinars, so you will not be receiving a further invitation. The links to the webinars was also included in the original invite. If you've misplaced your invitation, please go onto SANRAL's website and you can find the link there. Now later, possibly in June, there will be an online stakeholder workshop or workshops, which will be attended by selected representatives of the various stakeholder organizations, where we will seek further stakeholder inputs. And the intention is, of course, that the workshops will provide those inputs into the scenario planning and the development of a future desired state that will be used to progress the project. I trust you've enjoyed this webinar. I hope you have a better understanding of the status of the SANRAL Foresight project, and I hope you're going to add further value to the views of the eminent thinkers. Comment through points of clarity, critical questions, or further expert input as appropriate. And I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope many of you will be joining us on Monday, if not all of you on Monday and Wednesday. Please have a great weekend and a great day further. And so from all of us, goodbye and thank you very much. Thank you.